My name is Vivian Collier. I am 63 years old. And at 7:12 on a Thursday evening, I heard my daughter Grace say, "She's just going to embarrass us, you know how she is. She doesn't understand how things work with your colleagues," to her husband Martin, in the sunroom of their new house in Buckhead, while they believed I was still in the upstairs bathroom running water over a grease stain on my sleeve. The air in the hallway carried their voices the way old houses do, up through the stairwell and across the landing without any effort at all. I had stopped walking because my left shoe had caught on a loose carpet edge near the top step. That's the only reason I was standing still long enough to hear it. My hand was on the banister. The wood was cool and slightly waxy, the kind of finish someone applies to make old things look maintained. I noticed that before I noticed what they were saying. 14 years of examining structural finishes will do that to you. My fingers read surfaces the way other people read expressions. Martin responded, and his voice had that low, instructional quality I had grown used to hearing from him, the voice of a man who believed every room adjusted its volume when he entered. "Just tell her we're keeping the guest list tight, she'll accept it, she always does." I didn't move. I didn't shift my weight. I stood at the top of those stairs with my damp sleeve pressed against my hip, and something behind my sternum went very quiet, like a fan blade that had been running for years suddenly losing power. I was already calculating, not the insult, the timeline. How long ago had this started? How many invitations I had declined thinking I was being considerate, when really I had been managed out of the frame without seeing the hand doing it. Before I tell you what I decided in that stillness, tell me, what time is it where you are? And have you ever heard something you weren't supposed to hear? Because what you do in the next moment defines everything that follows. But I'm not here to talk to Grace and Martin, not really. They'll hear this eventually, or they won't. What I'm here to do is talk to you. Before I tell you what I found when I started looking, what time is it where you are? I want to know how many people heard something they recognized in that opening. Let me go back. My name is Vivian Collier. I retired 18 months ago from a career in construction claims adjustment. Specifically, I spent the last 14 years working catastrophic loss investigation for a regional insurance carrier based out of Charlotte. When a building burned, flooded, collapsed, or showed damage inconsistent with the claim filed, I was the person they sent. My job was to stand inside the wreckage and determine what actually happened versus what someone wanted you to believe had happened. I read char patterns on drywall. I measured moisture migration through subflooring. I cross-referenced contractor invoices against permit records and caught discrepancies measured in fractions of an inch. I once denied a $340,000 claim because a supposedly fire-damaged roof truss showed saw marks at a joint that should have been a fracture line. That skill had exposed fabricated losses for nearly a decade and a half. It was about to expose a fabricated version of my own family. But the instinct came first, before I ever connected it to my work, before I even named what I was doing. Standing in that hallway, my body responded the way it always had at a lost site. Don't touch anything. Don't announce yourself. Observe the scene exactly as it exists before anyone knows you're looking. I walked back to the bathroom, closed the door, ran the faucet for another 30 seconds, and came downstairs smiling. Grace had already set a plate of sliced pear and brie on the counter. Martin was pouring wine. Neither of them looked at me with anything resembling guilt. That was the part that stayed with me longest, not what they had said, but how easily they continued afterward, as though the conversation upstairs had been about adjusting thermostat settings. "Sleeves fine," I said, holding up my arm. "Just water." Grace smiled. "Good. Sit down, Mom." "Martin made that risotto you liked last time." I sat. I ate the risotto. I complimented it twice, and I drove home that night on I-85, with both hands on the wheel and every window down because I needed the noise. I need to tell you about the years before that Thursday, because the hallway didn't create the problem, it only gave me the frequency to finally hear it. Grace was my only child. Her father, my ex-husband Dale, left when she was 9, not dramatically, not with an argument anyone could point to, just a gradual withdrawal that ended with a note on the counter and his truck gone before sunrise. I raised Grace on a claims adjuster's salary, which in those years meant long drives, cheap motels near lost sites, and a daughter who learned to microwave her own dinners before most kids could tie their shoes. I was not a perfect mother. I was a present one, which is different, and I have made my peace with the distinction. Grace married Martin Calloway when she was 27. He was a dermatologist with a growing practice in Buckhead and a family whose money preceded them into every room they entered. Martin's mother, Judith, had a way of offering compliments that made you feel like you were being appraised. "What a lovely blouse, Vivian, is that from Talbot's?" It was from a clearance rack at Belk, but the question was never really about the blouse. I spent money I didn't have on Grace's wedding, $31,000. I know the number exactly because I refinanced my house in Kannapolis to cover it. When Martin's family offered to host the reception at their country club, I understood the unspoken arrangement. They would provide the venue, and I would provide the gratitude. I smiled through every course of that dinner. I danced with Martin's father, who held me at arm's length like I was a piece of rented furniture. The irony was that I had spent years examining buildings for hidden damage, water behind walls, rot beneath surfaces that looked solid. Turns out I had been inspecting strangers' houses while the rot in my own family was spreading behind drywall I refused to pull back. Over the years, Grace's visits became shorter and less frequent. She stopped coming to Kannapolis altogether around the time their second child was born. "It's just easier if you come to us, Mom," she said. "The kids have their routine." I understood. I drove the 3 hours to Atlanta every 6 weeks, sometimes more. I brought homemade peach cobbler in a foil pan. I slept in the guest room on a mattress so firm it made my lower back ache for days. I never complained because complaining felt like risking the invitation. Martin was unfailingly polite. He remembered my coffee order. He asked about my garden. He held doors open with mechanical precision. But underneath the courtesy, there was a sorting mechanism at work, the way he'd steer conversations away from my career, the way he'd explain things I already knew as though I were a visitor from somewhere less informed, the way he'd arrange seating at dinner so that I was always at the end of the table nearest the kitchen, never beside a guest who might ask what I did for a living. I was welcome in the house. I was not welcome in the presentation. The Thursday I overheard them was supposed to be a planning visit for their annual 4th of July party. 40 guests, catered, lanterns strung across the back garden. Grace had mentioned it weeks earlier. "You should come up that weekend, Mom. You can help me with the table settings." I had driven 3 hours specifically for that conversation. I had brought linen napkins I'd found at an estate sale, cream-colored with a faint botanical border, because Grace once said she liked florals. Those napkins were still in a bag on the passenger seat of my car when I drove home that night with the windows down. That evening, in my kitchen in Kannapolis, I sat at the table with the napkins in front of me, still in their tissue paper. The house was quiet. The faucet dripped the way it always did, a slow, patient rhythm I'd been meaning to fix for months. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I opened the Notes app on my phone and typed 6 words: "She doesn't understand how things work." Then I set the phone down and stared at those words for a long time. I was reading the scene, the same way I'd read 1,000 lost sites, not for what was obvious, but for what the obvious was covering. I spent 3 weeks after that night building what I'm about to show you. But before I do, where are you watching from? Leave it below. I want to see how many rooms this story reaches. The first thing I did was request my own financial records going back 7 years. Not because I suspected financial fraud, not yet, but because my training had taught me that when a story doesn't match the scene, you start with the paper. You always start with the paper. I pulled bank statements, canceled checks, wire transfer confirmations, credit card records. I organized them chronologically across my dining room table the way I used to organize subcontractor invoices on a folding table inside a damaged structure, column by column, month by month. And the picture that emerged was not what I expected. In 7 years, I had transferred a total of $94,200 to Grace and Martin. Not in one dramatic gesture, in dozens of smaller ones. $3,000 for the kids' private school registration, sent every August. $1,500 when their HVAC system failed. $5,000 toward their kitchen renovation, which Martin had described as a little refresh. The contractor's invoice, which I later obtained, showed the project totaled $87,000. I had contributed to something I was never shown the full scope of. That was layer 1, the surface. What I already sensed but hadn't yet quantified. Then I looked closer. Several of the transfers I had made were initiated not by phone calls from Grace, but by emails, and the emails had a pattern I recognized. They followed a specific cadence, a warm opening referencing something personal I'd recently shared, a casual mention of a financial pressure presented as temporary, and a closing line that preemptively thanked me as though the money were already sent. The language was efficient, almost templated. I opened the metadata on 3 of those emails. The author field on 2 of them showed M. Calloway, Martin's name, sent from Grace's email address. My daughter had not written those requests. Her husband had written them for her, using her voice like a font he'd learned to replicate. That was layer 2. The betrayal was not spontaneous, it was authored. I sat with that discovery for 2 full days. My hands shook when I poured coffee the next morning, not from the cold, but from something closer to the tremor you get when you've been holding something heavy for too long and finally set it down. I went still again, the second cold math moment. I wasn't counting money anymore. I was counting years. I was running the pattern backward through every generous email, every grateful phone call, every carefully timed visit, and I was seeing the scaffolding underneath all of it. Not a family reaching out in need. A system designed to extract, consistently and efficiently, from someone who had been trained by love to say yes. The older pattern, layer 3, required a phone call I did not want to make. I called my ex-husband Dale. We hadn't spoken in 4 years. He answered on the 5th ring with the cautious voice of a man who assumes bad news. I asked him one question: did Grace or Martin ever ask you for money? The silence lasted long enough to answer. Then he said, about $12,000 over 3 years. Martin called me directly. Said Grace was too proud to ask. Dale had sent the money without telling anyone. He assumed he was the only one being asked, so I wasn't the only source. I was the larger one. There was one more thing said in that hallway, a detail I haven't told you yet. After Martin said, she'll accept it. She always does, Grace responded with something quieter, almost an afterthought. Just make sure the trust amendment is ready before the 4th. I didn't know what that meant on Thursday night. It took me 11 days to find out. I requested a copy of my own estate documents from the attorney who had prepared my will 6 years earlier. His paralegal emailed them within 48 hours. The will was intact. Everything as I remembered, Grace as sole beneficiary of my estate, including the house in Kannapolis and my retirement accounts. But attached to the estate file was a document I had never seen. A draft amendment to a revocable trust, a trust I had never created, listing the Kannapolis house as the primary asset, with Martin Calloway named as co-trustee. The document bore my signature. Except it wasn't my signature. The slant was close, the letter proportions were nearly right, but the crossbar on my capital V was wrong. I've signed my name 10,000 times on claims documents, and I cross my V with a leftward stroke that dips below the baseline. This signature crossed rightward and stayed level. It was the kind of error that would fool a bank teller. It would not fool a woman who had spent 14 years examining contractors' signatures for authenticity on fraudulent invoices. The author field in the document's metadata properties listed Martin C_home, a device name that matched nothing in my attorney's office. That was layer 4. Underneath everything, beneath the managed invitations, the ghost-written emails, the coordinated financial requests, Martin had been preparing to take legal control of my property using a forged document. The hallway conversation wasn't about a party guest list. It was about a timeline. I did not confront Grace. I did not call Martin. I contacted a forensic document examiner named Dr. Pauline Sheff in Raleigh, who confirmed within 72 hours that the signature was inconsistent with my known exemplars. I then contacted my attorney, who confirmed the trust amendment had been submitted to his office by email, from an address he believed was mine but which, upon examination, was a slight misspelling, V's Collier with 2 L's instead of 1. I filed a report with the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office. I provided the metadata analysis, the signature comparison, Dr. Sheff's preliminary findings, and the email routing records showing the submission originated from an IP address registered to Martin Calloway's home office. Then I waited. The 4th of July party happened without me. Grace called the week before. "Mom, I think this year might be too hectic. Martin's partners are coming with their families and we're already over 40. You understand?" I said I understood. I did not say what I understood. 3 weeks after the party, I received a call from the DA's office confirming that a formal investigation had been opened. 5 days later, on a Saturday morning, I drove to Atlanta, not to Grace's house, to the Buckhead office of Rothwell and Keene, the law firm that managed Martin's practice finances. I had requested a meeting with their senior partner, a woman named Diane Rothwell, under the pretense of discussing estate planning referrals. What I actually brought was a folder. I arrived at 10:15. The office occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower on Peachtree, the kind of building where the elevator buttons are brushed brass and the reception area smells like leather and lemon oil. Martin had mentioned this office at least a dozen times over the years, always with a specific pride, the way a man gestures toward a building and means, "This is where I am someone." I signed in at the front desk. The receptionist offered me sparkling water. I accepted it. When Grace and Martin arrived at 10:40, summoned by Diane under separate pretext, Grace stopped in the doorway when she saw me. Martin's face didn't change at all. He sat down, he adjusted his cuffs, he looked at Diane Rothwell, and smiled as though this were a scheduling mix-up. I placed the folder on the conference table. Inside were the forged trust amendment with Dr. Sheff's signed analysis, the metadata report, the email routing documentation, the IP trace, and the 7 years of financial transfers organized by date and amount. Martin leaned back. "Vivian, I don't know what this is about, but I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding." I didn't respond. I opened the folder to the first document. "Grace," Martin said, turning to my daughter. "This is clearly some kind of..." Diane Rothwell interrupted him. "Martin, I've reviewed the preliminary materials Mrs. Collier shared with me earlier this week. I'd recommend you listen before you speak." He tried 3 things in the next 4 minutes. First, denial. That signature could be anyone's. Documents get routed through offices all the time. Second, reframing. "Vivian has never liked me. This is about control. She's never accepted that Grace chose her own life." Third, the family loyalty appeal, directed at Grace. "Are you really going to sit here and let your mother do this to us? After everything we've built?" Grace looked at the documents. She looked at the email metadata. She looked at the signature comparisons side by side. She didn't speak. Then Diane Rothwell said something I did not expect. She opened her own folder. "Martin, 3 months ago you asked me to notarize a power of attorney document for a client's elderly parent. I notarized it in good faith. Last week I learned that client doesn't exist. The POA was for a property in Kannapolis, North Carolina." She set the document on the table beside mine. "I've already reported this to the state bar." Martin's composure didn't collapse. It drained. Slowly, the way color leaves a face when blood pressure drops. He looked at Diane. He looked at Grace. He looked at the conference table as though it might offer a trapdoor. I said one sentence. "Martin decided that other people's names are just signatures he hasn't learned to copy yet." The room went silent. I did not add anything. I closed my folder and placed my hands flat on the table. Grace spoke for the first time. Her voice was thin and stripped of everything I'd heard in it for years, the rehearsed warmth, the managed cheerfulness, the careful modulation she'd learned from living inside Martin's presentation. "Mom," she said, "I didn't know about the trust document." I looked at her. "I know. And I meant it. The emails she hadn't written told me that much." But knowing she didn't forge the document didn't erase the years she had spent enforcing the smaller cruelties, the managed invitations, the end-of-table seating, the locked guest list, the hallway conversation where she agreed I didn't understand how things work. She hadn't held the pen. But she had held the door open for the man who did. The weeks after the meeting moved with the slow, grinding weight of machinery that doesn't stop once it starts. The Mecklenburg County DA's office expanded their investigation. Martin retained a criminal defense attorney. His medical practice partners received a formal notice from Diane Rothwell's firm terminating their financial management relationship. Within 6 weeks, Martin's name appeared in a state bar complaint filed by Diane herself, citing the fraudulent notarization. His malpractice insurance carrier opened a separate inquiry. The Buckhead house, the one with the sunroom and the hallway that carried sound, went on the market in September. Grace moved into a rental apartment in Decatur with the children. She did not file for divorce immediately, but the separation was public and final in tone. Martin pleaded guilty to 1 count of attempted fraud by forgery in November. The plea agreement included 2 years of probation, mandatory restitution of $6,400 in legal fees I had incurred, and a permanent note on his professional licensing record. His practice survived, but 3 of his 4 partners dissolved their affiliation within the year. The waiting room that once displayed a framed photograph of Martin shaking hands with the governor now displayed a generic landscape print from a catalog. Grace called me in December. Not to apologize, not exactly. She asked if she could come to Kannapolis for Christmas, just her and the kids. I said yes. She arrived on the 23rd with a suitcase and a small potted rosemary plant she set on my kitchen counter without explanation. The children ran through the house the way children do when they haven't been somewhere in a long time and everything feels slightly smaller than they remember. Grace stood in the kitchen doorway watching them. She looked at me and opened her mouth, then closed it. Then she said, "I don't know how to start." "You don't have to start," I told her. "You just have to stop pretending nothing happened." She nodded. Over the following days, she told me things, not all at once, but in pieces, the way someone disassembles something they've been carrying too long. She admitted she had known about the emails Martin sent from her account. She had seen the drafts. She told herself it was easier. She admitted she had agreed to exclude me from the party because Martin's partners' wives made her feel like she needed to prove she belonged. She admitted that somewhere along the way, she had started seeing me through Martin's categories, useful, manageable, temporary, instead of seeing me as her mother. That confession didn't repair everything. But it was the first honest architecture I'd seen from her in years, and I recognized it the way I recognize sound structure, not because it was finished, but because the foundation was level. In February, I enrolled in a week-long ceramics workshop at a studio in Asheville. It was something I had wanted to do for 11 years. I had mentioned it to Grace once, casually, during one of those early morning kitchen conversations before anyone else was awake. She had said, "You should do that, Mom." I never did. There was always a school registration fee, an HVAC repair, a kitchen renovation contribution, something that made my own plans feel like an indulgence the budget couldn't support. The workshop cost $400. I paid for it with money that was mine, for time that was mine, in a room full of strangers who knew nothing about me except that my hands were steady and I wasn't afraid of the wheel. On the last evening, I sat on the porch of the rented cabin with a mug of tea and the quiet dark of the Blue Ridge pressing in from every side. No hallway, no voices carrying. Just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of the cabin settling the way wooden things do when the temperature drops. I thought about that Thursday in Buckhead. I thought about standing at the top of those stairs with my damp sleeve and my hand on the waxy banister. I thought about the words I heard and the words I didn't say. There is a difference between loyalty and silence, and I spent too many years confusing them. Loyalty is a living thing. It asks questions, it holds people accountable, it stays even when the truth is uncomfortable. Silence is what loyalty becomes when it's afraid. I was silent at dinner tables where I felt small. I was silent in guest rooms where I didn't sleep. I was silent when the invitations thinned and the requests thickened and the distance between being loved and being managed became so narrow I couldn't tell which side I was standing on. My silence didn't keep the peace, it kept the pattern. What I learned, what the hallway finally made me hear, is that the people who tell you not to come are not always the people who don't want you there. Sometimes they are the people who need you gone so the version of the story they're telling can continue unchallenged. And the moment you stop leaving quietly, the story falls apart. Not because you destroyed it, because it was never built to survive your presence. Last month, I drove past the Buckhead house on my way to visit Grace at her apartment in Decatur. The new owners had painted the shutters a sage green. The sunroom windows were open. I slowed the car the way you do when you pass a place that used to hold something of yours, and I heard, faintly, through those open windows, a woman's voice calling someone's name, and a child laughing in response. Just ordinary life, filling a space that once carried words I wasn't supposed to hear. I didn't stop. I pressed the gas gently and kept driving. The linen napkins, the cream ones with the botanical border, were folded on my own dinner table now. I'd started using them on Tuesdays for no particular reason at all.